There's a photograph that surfaces occasionally in collections of Victorian family portraits that stops people cold the moment they see it. A young boy, perhaps 4 years old, sits perfectly still in a wooden chair. His back is straight. His hands rest on his knees. His expression is serious, almost grave, in the way that long exposure times demanded of everyone who sat for a photograph in that era. And around him, in the carefully arranged studio setting, there is nothing. No toy, no stuffed animal, no wooden horse or tin soldier, or any of the small objects we instinctively expect to see near a child. Just the boy, the chair, and the composed, deliberate stillness of someone who has been taught that this is what childhood looks like. You might assume the toys were simply left at home. You might assume the photographer asked that they be removed for the sake of a cleaner composition. And in some cases, you would be right. But in many others, you would not be. Because for a significant portion of Victorian childhood, particularly in its earliest years, the absence of toys was not an accident or an oversight. It was a choice, a deeply intentional, carefully reasoned, and passionately defended choice that made complete sense within the world that produced it. And understanding why leads you into one of the most surprising and illuminating corners of Victorian life. A place where medicine, religion, philosophy, class, and the very nature of childhood itself all collide in ways that feel almost alien to us today, but that reveals something profound about the human impulse to protect the children we love, even when the methods we choose look, from the outside, like deprivation. To understand the Victorian relationship with children and toys, you first have to understand something fundamental about how the Victorians thought about the human mind and body in early childhood. We live in an era shaped by developmental psychology, by the research of figures like Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, who taught us that play is not a frivolous distraction from development, but its very engine. We know, or believe we know with the confidence of scientific consensus, that children learn through play, that imaginative play builds cognitive flexibility, that physical play builds motor skills and spatial reasoning, that social play builds the emotional intelligence a child will need for the rest of their life. Toys, in our framework, are not luxuries. They are tools. They are the equipment of childhood development, as necessary in their way as food and sleep. The Victorians did not think this way, or rather, the early Victorians did not think this way, and the shift in thinking that occurred across the arc of the 19th century is itself one of the most fascinating stories in the history of childhood. In the early Victorian period, the dominant framework for understanding young children was not developmental or psychological, but moral and religious. A young child was not primarily a cognitive being in the process of building mental structures through interaction with the world. A young child was primarily a moral being, a soul in its earliest and most vulnerable state, susceptible to influences both good and bad, in need of guidance and protection and the careful cultivation of virtue, rather than the stimulation of imagination or the development of skills. And within this framework, toys were not neutral objects. They were moral agents. They could do good or harm, depending on their nature and on how they were used. And many of the toys available to children, or that children themselves were inclined to desire, were considered more likely to do harm than good. The specific harms that Victorian moralists, physicians, and educators attributed to toys and play were various and revealing. One of the most common concerns was overstimulation. The Victorian medical establishment had a deep and abiding fear of overstimulation in young children, a fear that seems almost comical to modern eyes, but was entirely sincere and rooted in a coherent, if ultimately mistaken, theory of how the brain and nervous system worked. The dominant medical thinking of the early 19th century held that the brain and nervous system of a young child were like a vessel that could only hold so much stimulation before it began to overflow, producing consequences that range from restlessness and disobedience to nervous collapse and even, in the most extreme versions of the theory, insanity. Toys that excited the imagination, that produced strong emotions, that demanded rapid and complex responses from a young child's developing nervous system, were therefore not just unhelpful. They were dangerous. They were filling the vessel too quickly, forcing a development that needed to proceed slowly and carefully, pushing a fragile system toward its limits before it was ready to bear the strain. This theory of overstimulation was applied with particular force to very young children, typically those under 5 or 6 years of age, which maps almost precisely onto the period during which many Victorian families restricted or eliminated access to toys. The logic was not that children should never play. The logic was that the play of very young children needed to be simple, calm, and carefully controlled, consisting of the kind of gentle, repetitive, undemanding activities that would allow the developing brain to grow at its own pace without being pushed or overwhelmed. A young child sitting quietly, watching the world, listening to a parent read aloud from an improving text, helping with simple domestic tasks, learning to sit still and attend. These were considered far healthier and more appropriate activities for a child under 5 than the excited, imaginative, emotionally intense play that toys tend to produce. The religious dimension of this thinking was at least as powerful as the medical one, and in many Victorian households, it was the primary driver of attitudes toward children's play. Victorian England, particularly in the middle decades of the century, was saturated with evangelical Christianity, a form of religious belief that took extremely seriously the doctrine of original sin and the consequent need for the careful moral training of children from the very earliest age. Within this framework, the natural impulses of a young child, including the impulse to play, to imagine, to desire toys and games and excitement, were not innocent expressions of a developing personality. They were manifestations of the fallen human nature that every child inherited at birth, the natural tendency towards self-indulgence, distraction, and worldly pleasure that needed to be carefully disciplined and redirected toward virtue, piety, and obedience. The most influential child-rearing manuals of the early Victorian period are startling to read today precisely because they make this logic so explicit. One of the most widely read and cited was written by a woman named Mrs. John Sandford, whose book on female improvement ran through multiple editions and was read by tens of thousands of middle-class families across Britain. She wrote, with perfect confidence and without a trace of doubt, that the first duty of a parent toward a young child was not to make them happy in the immediate sense, but to make them good, and that these two goals were often in tension. A child who was given everything they desired, including toys and games and the freedom to play as they wished, was a child whose natural selfishness was being indulged rather than corrected, whose fallen nature was being strengthened rather than weakened, whose soul was being put at risk in the service of a few hours of earthly pleasure. Better by far, in this view, to restrict and discipline the desires of childhood, to teach a child early that they could not always have what they wanted, that patience and obedience and self-control were more valuable than any toy. This does not mean that all Victorian children had no toys at all. The reality was considerably more nuanced, and it varied dramatically across different regions, different religious denominations, different social classes, and different individual families. What it does mean is that there was a powerful and widely shared cultural current in early and mid-Victorian Britain that was deeply suspicious of toys and play, that saw childhood desire for toys as something to be carefully managed rather than freely indulged, and that drew a sharp distinction between the kinds of play considered appropriate and improving and the kinds considered dangerous and corrupting. Understanding this current and understanding what it looked like in practice is what reveals the full strangeness and the full humanity of the Victorian approach to childhood. In practical terms, what did a toy-restricted early Victorian childhood look like? For children in the poorest families, the question barely arose. Working-class children in the early Victorian period often had little access to manufactured toys simply because their families could not afford them. Play for these children meant making do with whatever was at hand, stones and sticks and scraps of cloth, the improvised play of children who have nothing designed for the purpose, but find ways to play anyway, as children always have. The restrictions that concern us here are primarily those of the middle and upper classes, the families with enough resources to provide toys if they chose to, but who were influenced by the medical and religious thinking of their era to be cautious or restrictive about doing so. In these households, A young child's day was structured with a degree of deliberate intention that modern parents would find extraordinary. Waking, dressing, eating, lessons, outdoor time, domestic tasks, prayers, sleep. Every hour had its purpose. Every activity was chosen for the contribution it made to the child's moral and physical development. Free, unstructured play, the kind of play that children naturally gravitate toward when left to their own devices, was viewed with suspicion precisely because it was unstructured, precisely because it was self-directed rather than guided by an adult with the child's moral development in mind. A child playing freely with a toy was a child following their own impulses, and following one's own impulses, in the early Victorian moral framework, was the very definition of the problem that childhood education was supposed to solve. The toys that were permitted in more restrictive households were chosen with great care and deliberate purpose. Educational toys, objects designed to teach specific skills or impart specific knowledge, were viewed more favorably than purely imaginative ones. Alphabets printed on cards or wooden blocks, simple puzzles that taught shapes and patterns, maps and globes for older children, small models of tools and household objects that could be used to teach children about the adult world they would eventually inhabit. These were considered acceptable because their purpose was transparent and improving. They were not invitations to fantasy, but instruments of education. They did not stimulate the imagination in dangerous and unpredictable ways, but channeled the child's attention toward specific, manageable, morally safe content. Religious toys and games occupied a special category of approval. Illustrated Bible stories, small figures representing scenes from Scripture, simple board games whose content was drawn from religious narrative. These were actively encouraged in many devout households because they combined the natural human inclination toward play with content that was spiritually beneficial. A child who played with a set of Noah's Ark figures was not indulging their worldly imagination. They were engaging with sacred history. A child who played a board game based on Pilgrim's Progress was not wasting time on frivolous entertainment. They were internalizing the moral and spiritual lessons that the game had been designed to convey. This is why Noah's Ark sets were among the most common toys found in serious Victorian religious households. They were one of the few toys that managed to satisfy both the child's desire for something to play with and the parent's requirement that all activity serve a morally improving purpose. Dolls occupied a particularly interesting and contested position in this framework. For girls, dolls were generally considered acceptable because playing with them was understood as preparation for the domestic and maternal roles that girls were expected to grow into. A girl who played with a doll was practicing motherhood, learning to care for something smaller and more vulnerable than herself, developing the nurturing instincts that Victorian society considered the essential defining quality of femininity. But even dolls were subject to restriction in the most rigorous households. A doll that was too beautiful, too elaborately dressed, too obviously designed to delight rather than instruct, might encourage vanity, materialism, and an excessive attachment to worldly things. The ideal doll, from a strict Victorian moral perspective, was simple, modest, and clearly understood as a teaching tool rather than an object of desire. For boys, the question of appropriate play was even more fraught, partly because boys were understood to have stronger and more dangerous natural impulses than girls, and partly because the stakes of moral failure were considered higher for boys, who would eventually have to navigate the adult male world with all its temptations and responsibilities. Toy soldiers and weapons, which children have been drawn to throughout history, were viewed with deep ambivalence. On one hand, they prepared boys for the masculine virtues of courage, discipline, and patriotism that Victorian society prized. On the other hand, they excited aggressive impulses and could lead to rough, disobedient, and dangerous play that seemed to move a boy further from the controlled, virtuous manhood that was the goal rather than closer to it. The management of boys' play was therefore a constant negotiation between allowing the natural energies of boyhood some outlet and preventing those energies from becoming ungovernable. It is important to pause here and note that across the arc of the Victorian era, attitudes toward children's play underwent a genuine and significant transformation. What was true of the 1840s and 1850s was considerably less true of the 1880s and 1890s. The latter decades of the Victorian period saw the emergence of new ideas about childhood, influenced by the Romantic tradition's idealization of childhood innocence, by the growing influence of educational reformers who had been inspired by figures like Friedrich Froebel, the inventor of the kindergarten, and by a gradual shift in medical thinking that began to recognize the importance of physical activity and imaginative play for healthy child development. By the end of the century, the cultural climate around children's play had shifted substantially. The toy industry was booming. Department stores dedicated entire floors to children's goods. Christmas, shaped enormously by Dickens and by the influence of Prince Albert's German traditions, had become the great festival of childhood gift-giving that we still recognize today. Toys were no longer primarily viewed as moral hazards to be carefully managed. They were viewed as the rightful property of childhood, the means by which children inhabited and understood their world. But this transformation did not happen all at once, and it did not happen uniformly. Even as the broader culture was moving toward a warmer and more permissive attitude toward children's play, there remained substantial pockets of resistance. Families and communities that held to the older, stricter view that childhood was primarily a moral project rather than a developmental one, and that toys and free play represented a distraction from that project rather than a contribution to it. And even in families that had moved toward a more relaxed attitude about toys in general, there remained meaningful restrictions on what kinds of toys were appropriate and at what ages, with very young children typically receiving simpler, more controlled objects rather than the elaborate and exciting toys that older children might enjoy. The relationship between toys and social class in the Victorian era adds another layer of complexity to this story. The most elaborate and expensive toys of the period, the detailed dolls' houses with miniature furniture and tiny china dishes, the mechanical toys that moved and made sounds, the elaborate train sets that appeared in the 1860s and became enormously fashionable. These were the possessions of the wealthy. Middle-class children had access to a more modest range of manufactured toys, supplemented by homemade objects and the timeless play equipment of childhood, balls and hoops, and skipping ropes and kites. Working-class children, as noted, made do with very little. But across all these class differences, there ran the common thread of the belief that very young children, those under 5 or 6, needed less stimulation rather than more, simpler objects rather than elaborate ones, more guidance and structure than freedom and imagination. The specific form this belief took varied enormously depending on a family's resources and values. But the underlying conviction that early childhood was a time for careful formation rather than free exploration was remarkably consistent across much of the Victorian social spectrum. One of the most poignant aspects of this history is what it reveals about the emotional lives of Victorian parents. We sometimes make the mistake of assuming that the strictness and apparent coldness of Victorian child-rearing reflected a genuine emotional distance between parents and children, that Victorians simply did not love their children the way we love ours, or that they held their children at arm's length as a defense against the grief of losing them. The historical record does not support this view. The letters and diaries and published memoirs of Victorian parents are full of anguished tenderness toward their children, of sleepless nights and desperate prayers and grief so raw and profound that it reads as entirely contemporary across the century and a half that separates us. Victorian parents loved their children with exactly the intensity and vulnerability that all parents in all times have loved them. The difference was not in the love, but in the theory. They had a different framework for understanding what love required them to do. And within that framework, restricting a young child's access to exciting, stimulating, imagination-provoking toys was not a withdrawal of love. It was an expression of it. It was the choice to prioritize the child's eternal soul and moral character over their immediate pleasure, to make the harder and less popular decision in the service of what the parent genuinely believed was the child's deepest and most important good. This is perhaps the most important thing that the history of Victorian childhood can teach us. Not that the Victorians were right, though, but they were not entirely wrong either. Not that we should return to their methods, which we should not, but that the choices we make about how to raise our children are always embedded in a framework of beliefs about what children are, what childhood is for, and what our children will need in order to live good and flourishing lives. Our framework tells us that play is essential, that imagination is a gift to be nurtured, that toys are tools of development, and joy is not just permissible, but necessary. The Victorian framework told something different, or at least its earlier versions did. Both frameworks reflect genuine attempts to understand children and to give them what they need. Both get some things right and some things wrong. And both will look from some future vantage point, like a fascinating and somewhat puzzling record of what a particular civilization believed at a particular moment in history about the enormous, urgent, and endlessly complicated project of raising a child. The real reason Victorian boys had no toys until a certain age is not one reason, but many, braided together so tightly that pulling on any single thread begins to unravel the whole fabric of a civilization's beliefs. It is medical theory and religious conviction and class expectation and the particular grief of parents who had already buried children and could not afford, emotionally or philosophically, to treat childhood as something light and playful and safe. It is the story of a society that took childhood seriously, perhaps too seriously, in ways that produced both genuine wisdom and genuine harm. And it is, in the end, a story about love, expressed in the strangest and most unexpected of forms, through empty hands and quiet rooms and the deliberate, aching choice to give a child not what they wanted but what their parents, in their best and most sincere understanding, believed they needed.